All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon, and in this video, I'm going to talk about what a professional fighter told me, an ex-professional fighter slash and current trainer told me about the Terence Crawford, Errol Spence Jr., Yordenis Ugas fights that may take place next year, or actually the Ugas and Spence fight is going to take place next year, and had a very interesting prediction about how those fights would go for Errol Spence Jr. Let's talk about that in this video. All right, welcome back to the channel. It's your boy Fanon. Before I get into the subject matter of the video, though, please make sure to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed, and please, even if you are subscribed, make sure that you have the bell icon selected so that you can get notified of when we release our videos. Also, okay, and let's get into the video. All right, so spoke with some people. Constantly talking to people on Twitter, Instagram, right? People that are professional, former professional boxers. Some are actually current professional boxers, trainers, coaches, and the like. Had a very good conversation and an observation that was made about the Terence Crawford, Errol Spence Jr., and Yordenis Gamboa saga, which should play out next year. And the reason that I say should play out is because I truly believe that the fights are going to go off where Errol Spence Jr. fights Yordenis Ugas in the first quarter, towards the end of the first quarter, and that they're going to make the Terence Crawford, Errol Spence Jr. fight towards the end of the year. I just think that, 2022 is going to be the year where we get some really good fights throughout the year. I'm a hopeless optimist when it comes to the sport of boxing. However, I got a perspective, and I'm telling you, I think this is a very, very interesting perspective about Errol Spence Jr., Terence Crawford, Yordenis Ugas. Most people assume that the reason that the fight may not happen is because between Terence Crawford and Errol Spence Jr. is because of some purse bid or something like that. Well, the take that I heard, and I think is very, very interesting, I'm not sure if I agree 100%, but I think it's got a lot of logic behind it, is that it may not happen because the hardest fight for Errol Spence Jr. himself between the two may be the Yordenis Ugas fight and not the Terence Crawford fight. Now, this is the logic behind it. As far as Terence Crawford is concerned, when you look at Terence Crawford, imagine Terence Crawford is kind of being is an excellent fighter without a doubt, pound for pound #1 fighter in the world without a doubt. But just like every other fighter, Terence Crawford has weaknesses. And one of the weaknesses that we've seen from Terence Crawford, or one of the things that Terence Crawford has shown since he got to welterweight, is that he is somebody that is a slow starter. And by that, he gives up into a certain point until he knocks you out, right? Which is, the greatest until in the world, right? You're doing really well until he figures you out and he knocks you out, right? That, he is having rounds that are very, very close with fighters. The problem with that is when you have with Errol Spence Jr. specifically, is that Errol Spence Jr.'s work rate in rounds is so great compared to everybody else that Terence Crawford has fought that it will be very, very easy for Terence Crawford to basically lose every round up until he figures out Errol Spence Jr. and knocks Errol, and then turns it on and knocks Errol Spence Jr. out. That's pretty much how the fight played out with Kell Brook. The round, as long as the fight lasted, that fight was relatively close in the rounds. Same thing goes with Jose Benavidez. The fight other than the rounds where Terence Crawford won and he wound up knocking him out, those rounds were all nip and tuck, right? Not saying that Terence Crawford lost all the rounds against Jose Benavidez or Jeff Horn or Sean Porter, right? But all of those rounds were very, very close. The logic in this is that Errol Spence Jr., on the other hand, unlike the rest of those guys, is very active. And he's somebody that is throwing a lot, pretty much throwing punches all around, and they're very tight. He comes behind a jab. They're very, very tight punches. And it is going to be more than likely the case that if Terence Crawford is starting slow and fighting on the back foot, that Errol Spence Jr. is going to be picking up those rounds, right? Now, here's the problem and the difference between Errol Spence Jr. and the other guys that Terence Crawford has fought. If you look at the Mikey Garcia fight, or you look at, say, periods of time when, like the Danny Garcia fight, Errol Spence Jr. is good enough a boxer that he can let off the gas on you and box you from the outside. And because he does not make anywhere near the amount of errors that a guy like Sean Porter does, or guys like Kell Brook and those guys do, it's going to be very, very difficult because of Errol's size and because of his boxing ability for Terence Crawford to find a gap to take advantage of where there's just some real big flaw, and Terence Crawford can load up on a shot, hurt him, and get him out of there. The likelihood of him doing that with Errol Spence Jr., when Errol Spence Jr. is up on the cards after 7 or 8 rounds, and also the physical conditioning of Errol Spence Jr. and the fact that he will that if he's in full strength, he could get stronger throughout the whole fight, makes that a lot more difficult approach for Terence Crawford to take with Errol Spence. The way that Terence Crawford is going to have to beat Errol Spence is that he's going to have to exchange with Errol Spence Jr. and catch Errol Spence Jr. when Errol Spence Jr. is punching. But the difficulty of him doing that on a southpaw matchup is it may not actually come to fruition for him. So the work rate and the fact that the Errol Spence Jr. makes very, very few mistakes that really allow him to be open for shots unless he's opening up could make that a much more difficult fight for Terence Crawford than people think. Now, on the other hand, though, the question about Yordenis Ugas for Errol Spence Jr. puts out some matchup issues for Terence Crawford. For Errol Spence Jr. that may not be there with Terence Crawford, which is that Errol Spence Jr. again is a very, very active fighter, and so is Yordenis Ugas. Yordenis Ugas is, for large points in time in a fight, a come-forward fighter that really does like to mix it up with and exchange punches with guys. Like, take, for example, his fight with obviously a lot lesser opponent in Omar Figueroa, where he was mixing it up. Omar Figueroa liked to come and liked to exchange shots, was a very, very busy fighter, and that just gave Yordenis Ugas, who is a counterpuncher, that many more opportunities to execute. And add to the fact that Yordenis Ugas is a Cuban fighter who is just coming off of beating one of the best southpaw fighters that has fought in the last 20 years or last 30 years in Manny Pacquiao. You have a guy that really does know and is schooled in approach to dealing with the southpaw. So Errol Spence Jr.'s the southpaw advantage that he has in fights might actually not be there with Yordenis Ugas. So it was very interesting to hear the logic that there's a chance that, because they say, styles make fights, fighters don't make fights, that Yordenis Ugas' style, and it might actually cause more problems over the course of a fight for Errol Spence Jr. than Terence Crawford does, where Terence Crawford can be put on the back foot and is somebody that is looking to counterpunch, looking to set you up. But Errol is somebody that will put a bunch of rounds put a bunch of rounds in the basket, and then be able to box at any point in time and switch it up, which is something he can do, and a lot of people really do underestimate. Don't underestimate what happened with Mikey Garcia, where Errol Spence Jr. was not when he felt like he was not at full strength, but yet was able to just outbox, stay at distance against a smaller man, and just win rounds by boxing him. Errol Spence Jr. very well may be able to spin rounds just boxing on the back foot with Terence Crawford if he gets up in rounds, but may actually walk into some things with Yordenis Ugas and mix it up with Yordenis Ugas like he did with Sean Porter, and may lose by decision. So I thought it was really, really interesting. None of these fights are guaranteed, right? Terence Crawford can beat Errol Spence. Errol Spence can beat Terence Crawford. Yordenis Ugas, I have Errol Spence Jr. winning in that fight, but it was just a really, really interesting observation. You let me know what you think in the comment section. And with that, I'm out. Peace.